Hello and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. Well, it's definitely feeling very Octobery here today, so I'm going to respond to the requests for a pumpkin wrap pendant. You can of course use this as wall art or decoration if you prefer. I'm making mine with an oversized bail so it can be threaded and worn as jewellery, but you can of course just hang it up on the wall if you prefer. So I'm going to be using a thumbstone today. The reason I'm using a thumbstone, and this is a carnelian one, is because I love the convex and concave feel that they have to them. You can of course just hold them, they're beautiful to work with. If you don't have one of those or you don't want to work with one, a standard cabochon will work in exactly the same way. Now I've gone for carnelian because of its obvious warmth, and I'll also be working with all raw copper wire today, just because as the years go by it's going to naturally patinate, it will become darker and a little bit more weathered looking. You can use carnelian in a liver of sulphur dip if you want to make that happen a lot faster. I will pop a link down in the description to wires, which is where I get my raw copper wire from. It's wires.co.uk. They're fantastic. I'm not on commission from them. I just really like their product. So let's talk about the materials that we're going to be working with today. Our main wire is going to be the frame, and for this I've gone for a lovely heavy piece of wire. This is a 12-inch length of 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire, around about 12 inches. If you're working with a very large slab of your gemstone material, then of course you can size that up. In addition, I'll be using 0.8mm 20 gauge, and I'm also going to use just a small amount of 0.6 22 gauge half round wire. Now I didn't have any raw copper, but I do have this lovely bronzed colourway. I don't often work with special profiled wires because they're not enormously suitable for total beginners because they can get a bit twisty. However, we're just using a tiny amount of that today, so don't fret. In addition to that, I'm going to be hanging in with some 0.4mm and 26 gauge. These are all gauges that are very easily available. So to begin with, we're going to make a basic frame shape for our carnelian, or if you're using another gemstone, obviously whatever you're using. This is around about 12 inches of wire, and again to reiterate, it's 1.25mm or 16 gauge. You could use a slightly heavier wire if you want to. So I'm going to make sure that that is really soft and fluid in the middle. What we're going to do is to create a shape that wraps all the way around the outside, utilising that pumpkin shape in the landscape fashion. Now you can just press that down onto your work surface and wrap around, trying to get it centralised as much as possible. If you're using a very large gem, you may need slightly more than 12 inches. So I'm pressing down onto my page that I use as a backdrop. This is a section of very high quality wallpaper, and it's just pressed onto some rubber backing. So I'm just going to try and get some of the thumbprints off. Sorry about that. We do need to get a reasonable analogue of that shape before we go any further, and we don't want it to be completely tight because we will need to gain access all the way around. So looking to create that form just a little bit larger, so that's really snug, which would be great if I was doing a classical wrap, but we're going to be doing something slightly different today. So I'm just going to re-warm that wire up at the top where it's gone a bit janky, draw it over, and then open that out. So take your time. The better you make this shape now, the happier you'll be with your overall project. So do just take as much time as you need before putting some right angle bends up at the top with a little bit of a gap between them. So don't rush this step. And then we'll put some right angle bends up at the top with a small gap. So I'm just going to pull that away from my gemstone for a second, and I'm going to grip the rightmost wire just to the right of that central point and push the tail of wire upwards at that 12 o'clock position. Now I do like to have a bit of a gap between them because it enables me to put a weave in that bail a little bit later on. I do like a fancy Loki Bail, and I'll pop a link just up in the description now for you to have a look at later if you want to see the details of making that bail. It is a video that I have already uploaded. So let's just make sure that that is just to the right of centre. And then I'm going to flip the whole thing over and trying to keep that as equal as possible. If it does go awry, because you warm that wire before you work it, you will be able to move that over ever so slightly. So do take your time at this stage just to refine that shape perfectly. So I've taken a couple of minutes to make sure I'm really happy with the frame I've created around that gemstone. There's a little bit of a gap at either end. There's also a gap top to bottom, and I have allowed around about a 5mm gap between those two shoulder or upright wires just up at the top of the design. Let's pop that gemstone out of the way for a second. The next wire we're going to be working with is 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire. Again, I'm working with raw copper, and I'm just going to add a little bit of extra strength to just the central third of my wire. Now you can use this wire straightener tool. This is from Pendant. It's a really great tool for not only adding straightness to wire that's a little bit kinked, you can also add strength to wire to make it feel a little bit like the next gauge up. So what we're going to do is to put the wire in the centre of those 3 reels or rollers, pop that closed, and then you can just pull, release, pull like so. And what that does is adds a little bit more hardness to that central section. The next thing we're going to do is to band all of these wires together utilising that half round. So down at the base of our frame, what we're going to do is to add the centre of 2 of those wires on one side, and then the centre line of 2 of the wires on the other side of the frame. Now to begin with, it's a little bit unwieldy and everything's all over the place, but don't worry, it will soon come together. One of the reasons that I prefer to make the shape for our cabochon or for our thumbstone before banding everything together is that it's very easy to kind of deviate how neat the wrap looks if you do it in the other order. That's why this is just a little bit extra fiddly. So I'm just tilting this over so that you can see I've got 2 of those 10-inch lengths of 0.8 20 gauge one side of the frame and 2 the other side. Everything is side by side, nothing is kind of on top of each other. I'm just twisting it to show it to you. Now with the half round wire, it's easy to see which is the flat side because you get this almost ribbon of light when you pass it through the light, and on the half round side it's darker and duller. So put the flat side to the inside of that cab frame, bring all of those wires neatly together, and we're just going to band at the very central point around about 5 or 6 times, whatever makes you happy. Now you do need a little bit of tension therein, so I'm just going to grab my pliers and gently pull that down. I'm also just going to keep a check that all 5 wires are side by side, so nothing's lifting up, and I'm then just going to very carefully bring that half round around all of those wires in a nice banding fashion. Now 4 inches of wire is much more than you need, but it does make it easier when you've got a tail to work with. So every time I'm wrapping around, what I'm going to do is just apply a little bit of flattening. I'm very gentle with my flat facing pliers here. I'm not crushing that banding down. And then we're going to draw that around and cut away on the inside. So you may have some residue to do another design with this, or you may like to just work from the centre and cut the ends away. The idea, of course, is that when you get to the very end of your wrapping, let's just give that a quick squish. What we're going to do is rotate that so that it sits neatly, push over and cut that away halfway across the inside, so it kind of ends on the inside of that frame wire. I'm just going to push that down gently to give it a very soft little squish. Now when you are doing that squishing technique, you may find that the wires open up at that 12 o'clock position. You will also find that it might not be dead centre, so you might just have to scooch that over when you're ready. Now you can see on the finished piece I've only gone for about 5 or 6 wraps on that demonstration piece. You can go for slightly more if you want to, and because I cut quite a generous piece of this half round, I'm just going to pull that over the top one more time. Now let's trim that away just as it passes over the top of the inside of that frame wire. And then again, I'm just going to very carefully make sure that that end sits down flat. And then we'll have a look at that positioning. Now, if you do find that there is some looseness in your banding, you can tighten that up slightly by using one tip of the pliers above on the right hand side, one tip of the pliers below on the left hand side. Just draw that all together and then switch around, making sure that it looks nice and neat and tidy. When you're delighted with it, give it that final squish. Now, we're not crunching, we're just gently squishing that into position. So what we should have now are a bundle of wires connected to your frame. That's where we're going to start the next section of today's tutorial in just a moment. Once you're happy that your banding wire is nice and flat and centralised, we're going to add just a little bit of warmth to the outer thirds of that lighter gauge wire. You can do that on bulk if you prefer. Just grip a hold and give that a smooth through. Little bit of warmth on the ends there. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can use a thumbstone. The one I'm using is a Carnelian banded. And in terms of sizes, I would say really whatever makes you happy. You may need slightly more wire if you're using a huge piece. You can go for slightly less wire if you're using a very diminutive piece. So let's just pop that down out of the way. You've already made sure that that fits perfectly. So what I like to do with this is to get the rear side of the pendant or the decorative item to be sorted first. And what we're going to do is look at the two rearmost wires. So if I just tilt that up, it might go slightly blurry because it's out of the focal zone. I'm just going to lift up those front two wires just very, very gently, utilising some of that warmth that we've just applied. And I'm going to very, very gently push down just so that you can separate those two and get it clear in your mind what you're doing. Now, for this design, I'm going to take the nearest of the lower two of those finer gauge wires, a little bit of warmth, and then I'm just going to draw that gently across the back of the design in an arced shape. So you can really keep these lines quite close to the outside. If you prefer, you can even just go for one line. But what we're looking to do is to create a piece that will last for years and therefore be nice and secure. So pop your design in, make sure you've not got too much of a gap. That's a little bit too wide, so I'm just going to ensure that this sits back in, and there's around about a 5mm gap between those two upright wires. That's a little bit closer. I still have space at either end, but it's not too tight, it's not too loose. So that looks good for me, and it's going to start nearest to the central wire, which is our frame wire, and it comes across to the left hand. So it's from the right hand side all the way across to the left hand upright. That's where I'm going to start. And again, just make sure that your gemstone fits into position. Pinch that very, very firmly at that angle change point, and then draw the tail around, down between those two upright wires and back in the opposite direction. Now, one rotation around that wire is enough. If you want to go for belt and braces, you can take that round a second time. I'm just going to push that to make sure that it's nice and tight, and then give it a gentle little squisheroo. I'm then going to take the same wire, so it is the lower of the two wires. If I just put that back into its proper orientation, we'll do the same thing again, where we're just going to gently coerce the lower two wires downward slightly, the upper two wires upward slightly. And this is really just to help you get in your mind which piece you're working with. So on the left hand side of the banding, we're now going to apply a little bit of warmth quickly into the wire that's nearest to that central frame, and do an exact mirror image. So you can draw that across in a nice swooshy shape, so that it meets up at the right hand angle change at the neckline area. So again, this is the wire that is in the lower of the bundles from the lighter wire, and I'm starting with the one that's nearest to my frame, and I'm just going to allow that to sit in a mirror image to that first line that we made. Pinch it into position and then wrap it all the way around that right hand upright. Bring that back out in the opposite direction. Make sure that it is adhered nice and tightly. As I mentioned, you could take that for a second wrap if you desire. one will be sufficient to keep this nice and safe. And at this stage, you've got the opportunity just to make a few little adjustments if you wish to. Now, if you don't pre-harden this central section of that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire, these wires can be a little bit floopy. So we only want to pre-harden the central third, which is what kind of takes place just here. So I'm now going to go again to the lower bundle, the one that's behind the frame wire, and this is the one that's now furthest away from the frame. And I'm just going to do exactly the same thing again. So that will be drawing across the back of the design, coming up to the opposing neckline wire. So the lowest wire in my bundle, starting on the right hand side of that banding, drawing across the back of the design, just behind everything else that's already happened. Pinch it into position when you see a shape that you like, and draw that all the way around that left hand wire. Again, you can go once or twice if you prefer. And I'm just going to smooth those, make sure that I'm happy with them, pinch them down together so that they take as little amount of space as possible. You will then do exactly the same thing on opposition with the other side, which is the last remaining wire in the lower bundle. So I've just done that second wire from the left to the right and from the right to the left, making sure that those two little tied on bits are nice and neat and tidy. Before we add our gemstone into the design, we're going to make sure that that banding down at the bottom is absolutely central, and now I want it to sit flat if I bring the wires up and away from the desk. Then we can pop that gemstone into position, and you can see that we've made a nice little nest or a nice little cage for it. Little bit of warmth into those lower wires. And then I think I will start with the nearest to the frame over on the right hand side, so the one that's nearest to the frame, slightly lower on screen. Give that a warm through, and then I'm going to do exactly the same as I did, but on the upper side of those upright wires. So when we were working on the back, we took the wire around underneath the neckline wire, wrapped it around and pulled out to the side. So now we're working with the wire on top of the frame. I'm just going to bring that over across that central section. You might need to put a little bit more warmth into it. Bring that over the top of the other wires we've already used, and then wrap around the opposite neckline wire. So again, from the right hand side of that banding, you can push your gemstone down into position to make your life slightly easier, and then a nice swooping arc over to the opposing side. So I'm going to pinch that into the position I think it looks nicest, draw the wire over the top of that upright, all the way around, up the middle, and then out to the far side again. So we'll just make sure that that's nice and neat and tidy. Pull that away in a straight line. Then we will repeat with the second wire on the right hand side and take it from there. I'm now going to take the last wire over on the right hand side of that banding, give it a little bit of a warmth. You might find that that moves. I just wanted to show you that that's still a little bit wiggly. So if that does move, just make sure that your banding returns to the central section, equal and opposite to the uprights at the neckline. You can push against that if you need to. Little bit of warmth into that residual wire on the right hand side, smooth that around into position, and again the wires on the front we're bringing over the top of the neckline wires. So I'm just going to draw that into position and then pinch, pull that all the way around, up through the centre and over the top. You will then need to repeat in opposition on the second side, and again you can take a moment to make sure that all of these arcs are exactly how you want them to look. So do take time to just refine that shape. If you find that it's a little bit wiggly down at the bottom here, you can definitely give that a little bit of a pull from the other side to retain the shape that you're after. So take your time, repeat from the left over to the right, remembering to take the wires over the top of that right hand upright, all the way around and then out to the side. Now you have multiple choices when you're creating a bail or a hanging loop at the top of a design like this. I'm going to create my Loki Bail, which I earlier linked and will pop in the video description as well. And in order to do that, I'm going to use some 0.4 gauge or 26 gauge wire. And I would advise working from the reel. I'm going to do a basic 3 and 3 weave. I have a scrap of wire just here to begin showing you. We're going to wind on the one side. What I would say is kind of get yourself a really good strong place to start. One of the benefits of using a stronger wire, as we are today for that frame, which was 1.25mm or 16 gauge, is that it will be nice and resistant to twisting whilst you're creating a nice basket weave. So there is a video for basket weave available as well, but you can use whatever kind of strategy you want for that bail. Just noticed a sticky outy bit, which sounds like it will be a massive pain later. So let's resolve that issue before we commence weaving. Tidy up your wraps, and then I'm just going to show you the very beginning of that process. So I've got my wire coming from the top of the lower wire as you're looking at it, across the gap, underneath the upper wire, and I think because I started with 4, I will simply do a 4 and 4 basket weave instead. So we've got a nice gap between those two uprights, scooch them down into position, continue weaving as long as you feel fit, and then you can either make the Loki bail by following the other video tutorial or whatever bail you like. I'm just going to get on and make another one of these before I show you how to finish off with these extra tails of wire. Once you've created your bail or hanging loop of choice, we're going to work with these residual tails of that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire. So I've made sure that each of them are flush cut. For my demonstration piece, I cut them all to the same length, but you can leave them at random lengths if you prefer to reduce wastage in your wire. I'm just going to demonstrate how to coil these up. I'll be using my memory wire finishing pliers because they have a little pin on them that's the same length all the way along. You could of course use your bail making pliers if you prefer. So all I'm going to do is to create little spirals, and to do that I'm going to start rotating that wire around with the cut end going up towards the top open end of that plier prong. So I'm just going to keep moving that around. If you're gentle, you don't get too many tool marks, but I'm going to crush this wire in a second, so if you do mark that wire, don't overly worry about it. And I'm just going to create a coil as close to the beginning of that wire as possible. Just going to pull that down and out of the way so that I can get to those other 7 wires, and then I'll show you ways that you can arrange them. So I have a chaos of coils now. Of course, you could leave it like that if you really wanted to. However, I would say those are very definitely snag risks. One of the things you can do to reduce the risk of snagging is to ensure that the very last little cut bit on your coil sits very closely inside the end of that little coil. However, what I'm going to do is to squish them flat and then push them down over the surface of the design, which should really reduce the risk of anything catching. So to do that, I'm going to move my pliers across the entirety of that coil and just very, very gently start coercing it flat, so that it sits like so, and then I can pull that down over the surface. If you want to, you can also adhere that with small quantities of 0.4 26 gauge wire. You can wire that onto these little frames that we've created, but all I'm going to do is to squish each of them flat and then push them down. On my demonstration piece, I also included one little standard spiral, which you could just go for all spirals if you prefer. I just wanted to show you that there are lots of options in how you can choose to finish the neckline area of this design. So I've smushed all those springs relatively flat and just pushed them down against the top of the design. As I mentioned, you could use some lighter wire just to wire the outliers of these to the frames that you have available to you, or you could wire them all to one another, or you could just go for the usual flat lying coils if you prefer. Now, you could leave your pendant like that, but I like to ensure that everything is super safe. Even with that very heavy wire creating a nice secure frame, there is a risk that if you catch your pendant, it might ping out of the end. So I've got a little bit of a back and forth weave to show you, just for the outermost edges, and I'm just going to demonstrate this once. So this is why we left that little bit of a gap. I have a 10-inch length of 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire, and you'll need one for either side, so 2 pieces in total. we're going to start off by just posting it inside that frame wire. And what I want to do is to get this hooked on really, really strongly. So I would suggest going for around 4 or 5 wraps just to make sure that you get a really strong connection to that frame. I'm using my pliers to help me, which isn't great on the lighter wire, but it is great on my eye today. So let's draw that all the way around. And when we have got that wire in position, we'll neaten those loops and winding all up together. So one last rotation of the wire, I think. And then what we're going to do is to trim away as close to the inside of the wire as possible. And then just make sure that that's nice and neat and tidy. Now you can use your tools to do that, or you can use your nails to scooch it all up together. Once you have a nice, neat, tidy, strong start, we're going to start weaving from the outside wire on the front, back to the middle, to the outside wire on the rear of the design. So you can rotate. Just because I'm starting on the outside of the frame wire, just noticed a sticky uppy bit. Let's get that tidy. I'm going to take the tail of wire underneath. So from the top to the underneath on the next available wire, which is this inside one. You might need to lift it just slightly to get the wire into position. Now I'm working with raw copper, which is usually very well behaved, but this is indeed a scrap. So it's being a little bit tetchy. And I'm going to zigzag that across at a diagonal to the first of those outliers on the surface of my gemstone design. And I'm just going to pull that back to put a nice little bend in. So because I'm on top with the finer gauge wire, I'm going to take that underneath the frame wire in the centre. I'm going to pull that all the way through, again at a diagonal. Now because I want this to stay put, I'm going to rotate all the way around that frame wire once. Pull that through to the back, scooch that into a nice neat wrap. Now that will suffice, but because I like the design to have a little bit more visible impact, I'm going to take a second rotation around that frame wire, and I'm just going to carefully just coil that up neatly. I'm then going to flip to the rear of the design. Now my finer gauge wire is coming underneath the frame, so I'll take it over the top of that first available extra wire on the rear of the design, pulling that through and around again at a very similar diagonal angle. Put a fold in the wire so that it's ready to go. Finer gauge wire is coming from underneath that supplementary wire, so I'm going to take it over the top of the main frame wire, and here I'll wrap twice again. Now I can keep that in position just with the edge of my nail. And then you've got 2 visible wraps. Take the wire from the top of the main frame underneath that supplementary layer of wire. Pull that across to another diagonal and then back out to the frame. And you'll just continue to zigzag all the way up, once on the front, once on the back, to the middle, to the front, to the middle, to the back, and so on until you have enough just to ensure that your gemstone or your cabochon is going nowhere. Now I've just done that on the outside layers on both of those just to ensure the safety of my beautiful piece of carnelian. So once you get up to the top, finish with the same number of wraps around that main frame. Just tuck it in beside all of those coily bits that we've squished down onto the front. Then repeat on the second side and you are done. So here are my 2 pumpkin wraps featuring that gorgeous gemstone in the vibrant, at the moment, raw copper. Now that will naturally patinate as you touch it, or you could pop that in a liver of sulphur if you wanted to darken that up a bit. I do hope that you're enjoying the videos here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Don't forget to pop a like down on the video if you've enjoyed the content, subscribe and share as much as you possibly can. Have a beautiful day and I'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.